The transverbration reminds me, of in John of the Cross, where in the spiritual canticle, where the soul is seeking, the soul is wounded with love for Christ, the bridegroom. And as the spiritual canticle, the poem progresses, the bride discovers that the bridegroom is wounded. And so I think, when I think of the transverberation, her heart set on fire with love, I think, to me, I jump centuries ahead, but I think about the Sacred Heart devotion, and the Sacred Heart always pictured as a flame with love. And Saint Teresa burned with love for Christ, but she discovered that Christ was burning with love for her.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at www.icspublications.org. And this season, we're talking about the life of the great Saint Teresa of Avila, the foundress of the Discalced Carmelite order. And I'm very happy to have here with me Father Mark O'Keefe. As you may notice, he's not a Carmelite. He's wearing black. Father Mark is a Benedictine. But Father Mark, it's so good to have you back.
Thank you.
Yeah, Father Mark and I have a special history. It was about 10 years ago, close to 10 years ago now, that I was sitting. I was not a Carmelite, and I was sitting in a class in seminary with you, a class on Saint Teresa of Avila.
Right, exactly.
And that was also the same semester, actually, where I discerned that God was calling me to be a Carmelite. So it was really Teresa that played an important role in that discernment, but also through your help as well. So
it's kind of you to say so.
Yeah. Well, Father Mark is, he's really, he'll blush at me saying this, but he's an expert on Carmelite spirituality, and I'd say especially on Saint Teresa of Avila. So it's a real gift to have you here. We might reference some of the books that he's written throughout this episode, but here's one that came out recently on St. Teresa of Avila, The Intimate Sharing of Friends. Father Mark, I don't know if you could you give us like a 2-sentence summary of what you think this book's about?
Yes, St. Teresa is the great teacher of prayer, and I kind of try to lay out that teaching in an ordered sort of way, beginning with the Teresa's basic understanding of prayer as an intimate sharing with Christ.
Yes, yeah. And I've read it. It's an excellent book. I definitely recommend it. We might reference some other books of his as we go through. But so in this episode, we're going to cover a period of St. Teresa's life that I think is maybe not talked about really too much. It's the period after her kind of conversion, but before she really receives her vocation as far as like a foundress to start this new monastery. And so there's a period here of about 8 years, I guess, where she's in the monastery, and I think it's an important period because she's experiencing a deepening of her prayer life, new experiences of prayer, and she's struggling with that reality, and so there's a lot. It's like I think it's important because her conversion there isn't definitive in the sense that the work of God is done. Like God continues to work throughout this time. And so I guess maybe a good place to start is my understanding is that at this time Teresa begins to really experience for the first time more contemplative graces, the graces of contemplative prayer. And so maybe you could say something about like what were those graces that she was experiencing there?
Well, as she describes, as she teaches, especially in the way of perfection and the interior castle, she was blessed to be introduced to the prayer of recollection as a young nun, and she learned to practice that. It was her main source of prayer, but she couldn't imagine. She couldn't use meditation in the way it was accustomed to be used at the time. And from recollection, as she entered into this period, she entered into kind of infused prayer, to real contemplation, which is a gifted form of prayer, a wordless form of prayer. And she describes these early stages as recollection and the prayer of quiet. And both names kind of tell us what the experience was like for her. And from then, even during this 8-year period, she began to have really mystical graces, and many of them. Locutions, that is, she heard words, visions of different kinds, and the kinds of things that are fascinating to people, her raptures and ecstasies, and even levitation. So.
And it seems like, at least at the beginning of this, though, it wasn't necessarily all the fireworks of the great, experiences of levitation and things like that. It was really this deepening, like maybe more quiet form of prayer. However, it seemed that there was maybe some suspicion about that at the time. Like there was a lot going on in the milieu of Spain and at the time. Could you say something about how would Teresa herself have received this and also those around her, what she was experiencing?
In the life we read that some of the people she consulted first, once she had entered into this period of deeper prayer, they reminded her that a number of women mystics had gotten into trouble with the Inquisition. The Inquisition was very concerned about false mystics. There was a movement around the time called the Alumbrados, the enlightened ones, the illuminated ones. And these were people who had practiced the prayer of recollection, which Teresa herself learned. And from that, they believed that they had entered into a deep experience of God, and perhaps some of them had, in fact. But perhaps because of lack of catechesis, just being in error, they began to believe that these who had fallen into error, they believed that because they had a personal experience of Christ, they didn't need the church. They didn't need the sacraments. They didn't need the hierarchy. Some of them believed they didn't even need the Bible anymore. And so the Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition, was very much concerned about this, and concerned especially about women who went down that path, because women at the period were not allowed to go to university. They weren't allowed to get advanced training. St. Teresa was unusual and blessed in that she was literate. She loved to read. But she was quite aware, and her friends cautioned her, that many nuns and mystics had gotten into trouble. And so she would have been quite aware of that. And had she not been, people were telling her that. And her efforts to find a spiritual director was difficult also because of that, because the directors were aware of that and to some degree afraid to become involved with her.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see the wisdom of Teresa here, because it's like she was experiencing this deepening of her prayer, and even when you read her life, it's like her first reaction is, well, I need to go ask for help about this. And I think there's just so much wisdom there. Like, I need to go to those who know about these things and seek out advice.
Exactly. Part of that, as I mentioned, is the recognition of the Inquisition was watching. But when you read Saint Teresa, we see that she's a woman who's dedicated to discovering the truth. And she's dedicated to self-knowledge. In her writings, she makes that very clear. It's the need for self-knowledge throughout the spiritual journey. And so she was a woman who didn't want to be deceived. And so it wasn't just that she was looking at the Inquisition, it's that she herself wanted to be sure that she wasn't being deceived by the devil or deceived, kind of a self-deception. And so getting the learned advice of others was very, very important to her.
Yeah. And so Teresa goes to all these, different people to ask for advice, different spiritual directors. Could you say something maybe like what was, we have a concept of spiritual direction of what it's like today, but what was spiritual direction like in Teresa's time?
Well, Teresa in her writings, she uses two principal terms for a spiritual director. Master, maestro, the spiritual master, a master of the spiritual life. But the term she uses most often is confessor, because at the time, only men could get theological education, and only priests did spiritual direction, what we would call spiritual direction now. And so generally for a cloistered nun, spiritual direction would happen when the appointed confessor came to hear confessions. And during that visit, not necessarily during the actual sacrament of confession, but during that visit, the nuns would be able to speak more broadly about their spiritual lives. So Teresa's experience of it was very much with priests of the time. She always sought out learned priests who had a good theological education, so that, again, she would not be deceived.
And I also find it interesting, while she was receiving this sort of formal spiritual direction, perhaps from priests, she was also going to other people, even like a layman who lived in the area, or friends of hers, to ask for spiritual advice as well. So she didn't limit herself as far as where she was getting kind of direction from. There was a kind of a breadth to that, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, for the advice that she was getting.
Yeah. In the life, she tells us that one of her first directors was a diocesan priest, but she was directed to him by this saintly gentleman, as she called him, Francisco de Salcedo, and apparently he was very influential, and she looked up to him very much. But we see also in the life that she had friends, lay women, they benefited from kind of her direction of them, but also she clearly benefited from spiritual conversation with them, and many of them, a couple of them at least, facilitated her finding directors who could help her.
Yeah, I find it interesting in this period of her life, when she's writing the book of her life, she's very open about some of the troubles she experienced with spiritual directors, but she always speaks of them in a very good light still.
Yes.
And so even like this first director, that this diocesan priest, she says how he was such a holy man, and she went to him for advice. Again, she's experiencing these a new form of prayer, a deeper form of prayer, a more contemplative form of prayer. She goes to him, and what's the result of that experience for her?
Well, she tells us in the life that she was kind of in awe of him because she thought he was so holy, but he was ultimately what she would call, not about him in particular, but not discerning. That is, he pushed her too hard. He assumed that if she was having more advanced prayer, that she would possess more virtues than she says she did. Now, St. Teresa was always very humble about the virtues she possessed, but she certainly felt that he was pushing her in a way that she wasn't ready. At the same time, she confessed in the life that she wasn't entirely honest with him. That is to say, she was holding back some of her faults as she understood them, so that because he was so holy, he wouldn't think badly of her. And when St. John of the Cross talks about spiritual direction, he warns directees about being completely honest. And Teresa does too, the importance of being honest with a director.
Yeah. There's also, I think, a great lesson there from Teresa about, I think many people who are experiencing this beginning of contemplative prayer, they maybe feel the same way Teresa did, or the same way this priest did, perhaps, of like, well, I'm not holy enough. This can't actually be what's happening within me. But maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Well, exactly. Yes, exactly. That's it's all a process, and Saint Teresa continues to describe her own what John of the Cross would call purgation, her own conversion. After she has received the mystical gifts, even it's a process, and as is clear in her own life, you don't have to be holy at the beginning. Teresa says that even some of the mystical gifts God gives precisely to draw people, so that they'll pursue the life of prayer and the spiritual life, the Christian life, more energetically.
Yeah, and it's a good lesson, I think, too, not to judge other people's virtue either, and the compatibility or incompatibility of their prayer as well, because often virtue is the virtues of others can be hidden from us too, and we don't always know what's going on in someone's spiritual life. So, so maybe, I don't know if now, I mean, we can go into this a little bit further later too, but maybe you could say here, we've already mentioned a few things, but like, Teresa kind of lays out, in a very nice way, but she lays out some of like bad characteristics of spiritual directors and things that caused her to struggle. Could you maybe like lay out, what do you think some of those bad character, or if you want to put it in a more positive light, what are the good characteristics?
Well, the first spiritual director, as holy as she perceived him to be, pushed her too hard. But there were directors that she felt didn't push her hard enough. She speaks especially of one who tried to convince her that she didn't have to worry about venial sins, that it would be all right, or her imperfection. She didn't have to worry about her imperfections. But she came to see later, of course, that, God wants it all, and we can't be content in the way we are. We have to be with God's grace moving forward. She also tells us that she encountered a number of directors who they lacked the experience. Their own spiritual journey was far not advanced enough alone on their own to advise her about some of the things she was experiencing. Now, many of them were helped if they, what she would call learned, if they had received training or they had some understanding of how the spiritual life might unfold, even if they hadn't experienced it. And in that regard, St. Teresa, she talks, it's kind of funny, she talks about half-learned men, that she found it very difficult when she encountered men who kind of thought they were learned or should have been learned, but they really didn't know how the spiritual life would progress. There was a lot of, at this time in Spain, there was a lot of an influx of mystical literature from other parts of Europe being translated into Spanish. And so really there was an opportunity for learned people to have read things about mystical prayer and mystical experiences, but a half-learned priest wouldn't have. And so he wouldn't have been in a good position to help her think through what she was experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Well, right, and that's why these first directors come back to Teresa and basically tell her, well, these experiences are dangerous. They might be from the devil. Resist them.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And
well, that's the thing with that first director she had, Daza, who she respected immensely. In the end, he told her that he believed that what she was experiencing was from the devil, which caused her great distress. And it was through one of her spiritual friends, a laywoman, that she was directed to the Jesuits. And she had several very young Jesuits, recently ordained. But the Jesuits at the time were also recently founded. And they had a real spiritual fervor. And as much as they were an active order, they were very much committed to contemplative prayer. And so with those directors, she was able to find some who weren't convinced that, or moved to believe that she was being influenced by the devil. But yes, that was a kind of a very difficult beginning of a spiritual direction for St. Teresa, to begin with that judgment.
Yes, and it seems, one thing I noticed in the difference in the language that she uses talking about certain directors is, it seems like these Jesuit directors, besides being like the things you mentioned, being learned and I think prudent and having good discernment, but they also they encouraged her.
Yes, yeah.
And that's a word that she uses, like, he really encouraged me.
Yes. Well, Teresa, her experiences began to be known, and she says that there was a particular director who apparently was concerned about what she was experiencing, so he was trying to consult with lots of people, and so the word got out that way. But she says of herself, too, that sometimes she was indiscreet about talking about what she was experiencing. So this resulted in people kind of knowing that she was having these experiences, and so they were talking, and apparently some of them were saying it was demonic, that this was probably like false mystics that were known to them. And so Teresa needed reassuring. She needed directors who could ensure her that she was on the right course, that she should stay the course and not give up. And so these early directors were critical to her in that reason.
And going back to the that kind of first judgment from Gaspar Daza is when he kind of determined this might be from the devil. One thing I forgot to mention there that I think is so key is Teresa was reading a spiritual book, and in reading that spiritual book, the Ascent to Mount Zion, she was reading about what she was experiencing.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that was so important to be able to kind of give words to the reality that she was experiencing, because she didn't have the words necessarily herself.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, we remember Francisco de Osuna, his third spiritual alphabet, but it's Bernardino de Laredo, his Ascent to Mount Zion, that, as you say, gave her the words. And in fact, she would present that. You can say, well, I learned it from this book. But I guess half-learned people who hadn't read that sort of thing, were not easily convinced of it, I guess.
When I feel like many of us have that experience too, either reading the lives of the saints, reading Teresa of Avila. That was my own experience, is reading Teresa. It's like, someone's putting words to like what I'm experiencing, and it can be a very refreshing thing to see that.
Well, absolutely. I think that's why St. Teresa's teaching on prayer and kind of the stages she describes in the Way of Perfection and the Interior Castle and the life too, they're classic because they help people. They have helped people over the last 500 years to put words, to have names for their experience.
Yeah, and the both the positives and the struggles, like the difficulties that she experienced with distractions and all it's so refreshing to read that and think, here is this saint who has the same experience in prayer that I do.
That's the thing, I think when people start reading St. Teresa, they're thinking about the visions, the locutions, the ecstasy, Bernini's famous statue of St. Teresa in ecstasy of the transverberation, and all of that's true. But in the course of describing her prayer, when you actually read St. Teresa, she doesn't shy away from talking about the struggles she had, the difficulties she had, the dryness, the determination it took for her to keep going.
Yes, yeah. So, Teresa's going through this period now, she's almost jumping from Jesuit director to Jesuit director, not from her own decision, but because Jesuits keep getting transferred out and moved around and things like that. So she's having, a number of different directors, but she's had pretty good experiences with the Jesuits in general. But it's interesting because now, too, there's, again, this is such an interesting period of her life because there's a saint that comes into town, and St. Francis Borgia, who Teresa has the opportunity to speak with as well, and he's able to kind of encourage her on the way.
Yes. Well, actually two, and both of them, Teresa's ability to encounter them facilitated by her laywomen friends. But Francis Borgia, of course, he'd been a Spanish duke, a high nobleman. He had had a conversion experience and entered the Jesuits. But he had a fame of holiness. And he was passing through the area. Teresa was able to meet with him. And even while others were telling her that she might be under a demonic influence, he assured her that he was that she was on the right course. And a little bit later, St. Peter of Alcantara, the Franciscan, also was able to assure her. And apparently, it appears that in their conversation, they were both encouraged and supported. But he was a great help to her in her prayer, but also in the kind of the spirit of the foundation of the Discalced as well.
Yeah, it's just amazing to see like all these saints kind of coming together and their lives meeting in different ways. And I just see, I think especially in Carmel that this is the case where even still the saints kind of enter into our lives in different ways. And we see the influence that like Teresa had on John of the Cross, but also through their writing, we see the way that they've influenced, like reading this book of her life is what helped Edith Stein, St. Teresa Benedicta convert, and find her vocation. So, and, St. Therese has been touched the lives of so many and influenced Elizabeth of the Trinity. So anyways, we just see the way that this was happening in real life in the time of, in real time in the life of Teresa, these saints kind of coming into contact with each other and helping one another. But we have the grace too, I think, of continuing that.
Exactly. But, I think one of the interesting things about St. Teresa's encounter with Peter of Alcantara is she recounts how his kind of feats of asceticism, how he slept hardly at all, how he only slept seated with his head against a stone.
He'd only eat every 3 days.
Yes, and he would never look up. He had lived in a friary for like 3 years, and he couldn't tell the faces of his own confreres, never looked at a woman. And she recounts all of that with great respect and awe. But she doesn't encourage it, So she's able to kind of look at the saint, this kind of living saint, later canonized, and see the virtues, see what she could learn and be inspired by, without thinking, I have to be exactly like that, or I have to encourage people to be exactly like that.
Yes, yeah, that's so important because God calls us all in different paths, and she saw that was his path, and it wasn't her path. The way she describes him, it's like she describes like he was like tree roots.
That's right.
Like he's just so thin that's all that he's like, just tree roots of a man. So. And so she admired him for that, but also she knew that wasn't her path, and it's not necessarily our path either.
Right, exactly, yes.
Yeah, that's a great point there. There's something else interesting that happens in Teresa's life here is that there's a period of like maybe even 3 years where you mentioned this laywoman, Doña Guiomar, and Teresa goes and lives at her house for 3 years. So here's Teresa, this nun at the Incarnation, a Carmelite monastery, and she goes and lives at this woman's palace basically for 3 years. What are the conditions that like allowed for that kind of thing? And again, in God's providence, it's exactly what Teresa needed.
Exactly, yes, in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
Yes, well, the Monastery of the Incarnation, where Teresa made her profession, it was a very large monastery by the time of St. Teresa's maturity. There were probably 200 nuns there. It was a huge complex for the time. And they really didn't have enough money to support all that. And so that made it necessary for the nuns to be able to come and go a bit, to some of them to actually board with their families, but also, in a sense, to kind of pay visits to benefactors. But one of the things that they could do, and this is Teresa's experience here, sometimes women of the high nobility, when their husbands died or they suffered some loss, they would ask the monastery to send a nun to kind of be a comforter to them. And this is what happened to St. Teresa. She was kind of a comforter. But Doña Guiomar benefited from her stay, but also she became the channel for meeting Francis Borgia, for going to meeting her first Jesuit spiritual directors, and to meet Peter of Alcantara as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's interesting that in the life of at the Incarnation, at the monastery, Teresa's life maybe would have been very busy and maybe distracted, and wouldn't have allowed her to have this type of prayer even, or access to these directors that really helped her to grow. And yet it turns out here she is living in this palace, but she spends all day in prayer and or speaking about the Lord with this woman, and then she's able to meet with these spiritual directors, and so she's making like very rapid advancement now in the spiritual life, it seems like.
Yes. It's reading her describing her time with these noble women, it's very interesting because she speaks of them with great respect and with great compassion, and yet she sees their lifestyle is just a difficult lifestyle, and there's a lot of superficiality to it. And so, in fact, some of the things she says to her nuns, in the way of perfection, especially, about how fortunate they are that God has called them to the monastery, because in life the experience of women of this period was very limited and very small, and it was easy to get caught up, especially for these noble women, in the superficialities of life. And so it was kind of Teresa was able to, even beyond kind of strictly spiritual life, kind of comment on the economic, cultural realities of the time.
Yeah, and it seems like it was perhaps within this context too of seeing the lives of these noble women, again the virtues and perhaps some of the vices, that Teresa herself had a kind of important mystical experience where she heard the voice of the Lord telling her, "No longer do I want you to converse with men, but with angels." And in that she says she talks about just like the great freedom that she experienced.
Well, I think this had been a struggle of St. Teresa early on, because she was very sociable and apparently very charming, and she liked being liked. She liked being even admired as a young woman, and that's, as she described early in the life, about her attraction for the visiting parlor, where the people of Avila would come down and visit, and she enjoyed it. And she would use that as an opportunity to give spiritual advice as well. But because she was so extroverted and so sociable, it became kind of also an obstacle to her that was, she felt, preventing her from kind of growing in her life of prayer, to which God was calling her. And you recall that this is one of the things that was a source of great discouragement for her. That on the one hand, she felt like God was giving her graces and calling her deeper, but early on that she was kind of attracted by visiting with people and sometimes on silly topics, speaking on silly topics. And so the resolution of that later on was very important to her, that to kind of set her on more firmly on the contemplative path.
Yeah, and there's a few things that stand out to me about this experience. Is one, again, in the last episode we talked about her conversion, but it just shows how conversion's not, a one-time thing in our life. And these are, like you said, the same struggles that Teresa was having before, of kind of living sort of halfway, feeling drawn towards things of the world, but also towards the things of God. And so it just shows us how, conversion just continues, continues throughout our lives. God is continuing to work in those places. But also, this last time reading this experience of Teresa, this is the first time I noticed this, but the words that she uses are actually very similar to the words that Therese uses when she's talking about her Christmas grace. I'm just going to read a section of of what Teresa of Avila says there. She says, "May God be blessed forever, because in an instant he gave me the freedom that with all the efforts of many years I could not obtain by myself." And so there's something really beautiful in this of like, for many years she'd sought this freedom, and she couldn't do it on her own. And then the Lord in an instant gave it to her. And that's the same way that Therese describes her Christmas miracle of kind of overcoming her focus on herself, her sensitivity, is in an instant the Lord did what for many years I couldn't do on my own.
Well, St. Teresa tells us, she cautions us that the thing we should always be seeking is conformity to God's will. That's the union that she always wanted, conformity to God's will in all things. And this path of contemplative and ultimately mystical prayer and the transforming union in this life, she says they are tremendous help on this journey to be conformed to Christ. And so when she describes her mystical graces, she always describes the fruit it bears. And I think we can see in what you've described there, that the benefit of this kind of encounter with Christ in her mystical experiences, and it challenges us to, number one, to the determination to keep moving along, and to be open and pray for the grace that God can accomplish in us what we can't accomplish in ourselves.
Right. I like what you said about some of this. Even this experience is almost the fruit of these years of prayer now that she's been living, because that's exactly what's happening in contemplative prayer. Is God's kind of weaning her away from her attachments to the world. Again, good things. I mean, not even sin, but attachments to things of the world, and drawing her more towards Him. And so I think this is good too, because it shows how we can interpret this experience in a broader sense in our own lives. Like Teresa's talking about conversing with people, but it's more the attachment. And so we all have these little attachments. And again, Teresa doesn't say that this is sinful, these friendships that she has, these conversing that she has, but they're things that are drawing her away from her spiritual life. And so we all have those things, maybe not friendships or conversations, but other little attachments. And there's a sense in which through prayer, like God can free us from them.
Exactly, yeah. I think about, too, when in 1559, I think, when the Spanish Inquisition issued their index, which forbade the publication of all these spiritual books that she had depended on. And she heard a voice from the Lord saying, from now on, I'll be your living book.
Yes.
And I think, that too was kind of a weaning. Teresa had read, and she was an avid reader of those books, and they helped her to give her language and to move her forward. But I think in that, the Lord was really inviting her to enter into the experience, to kind of trust what the Lord was doing in her life, and not to make herself dependent on the books that had been such a help to her. Yes. And so really, it's how God works through things at first that seem to us to be a hindrance. God can make it turn into something positive. And I think even the prohibition of the books worked out to be positive for St. Teresa.
Yeah, that's an interesting bookend of sorts here too, because we were just saying at the beginning about how much the books had helped her to even be able to enter into this prayer. But then there was a time when the Lord said, "No, that's enough for now. I'll be your living book." So.
Yes. And that's the impetus for her to start writing.
Yes.
Because ultimately she has to write because all the books are prohibited now, and so we have the benefit. We have the fruit of that because she felt this need, this call to write.
Yes.
And we're blessed by that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. What do you think? Maybe we could turn here a little bit to talk about the more extraordinary graces that Teresa was experiencing. Maybe we don't need to go into too much detail about the particulars, but could you just kind of lay out maybe some of like what were the kinds of experiences that she was having? I think you mentioned some of them earlier.
Yes. Well, the most systematic laying out of the stages is in the interior castle. And St. Teresa describes in the interior castle most of, not all of them, but most of these extraordinary experiences in the sixth dwelling places. And so they are locutions, words, they are ecstasies and raptures and flights of the spirit. That all of those are about the same. Ecstasies, raptures, flights of the spirit. And that's the experience, in recollection and the prayer of quiet, God gathers the soul into quiet. But as the soul advances and begin to experience union, God absorbs the faculties, absorbs the attention, and so the person is, in a sense, kind of taken out of themselves. This is especially the experience of rapture and the flight of the spirit. And so these were extraordinary experiences, and then the visions. And St. Teresa describes her first vision, early on, a vision of Christ, what she called an intellectual vision. St. Teresa accepts, and this was very helpful to her, accepts a distinction that St. Augustine had made between corporeal visions, imaginative visions, and intellectual visions. And so in a corporeal vision, one would see Christ or the saints or the Virgin with one's eyes. She said she never experienced that. An imaginative vision is when God bypasses the senses and, in a sense, implants the image right on our imagination. So one is seeing Christ in a particular form, or the angels, or the saints, but one's not seeing them with your physical eyes, but they're kind of implanted into your imagination. And the intellectual visions are those visions where God bypasses the senses and the imagination altogether and implants it directly within. St. Teresa says it's like having food put in your stomach without eating. And St. Teresa had the last two kinds, imaginative visions and intellectual visions, and she said they often came together. You remember this first vision, intellectual vision after she had of Christ. She was telling her confessor about it, and he said, well, what did he look like? And she said, well, I don't know, because it was intellectual vision. It's like a vision, but it's not a vision like with the imagination or the senses that you would have.
And something I think important that both Teresa and John of the Cross teach us about these is that actually the more interior a vision is, the I don't want to say the more real, but the surer it is, and the more safe it is. And I think we often have the opposite experience. And that's why even her confessor here is asking, like, he wants to know how Jesus looked when Teresa saw her, but it wasn't that. And I think we often have a mistaken concept that, like, oh, if I get a vision, an external vision of the Lord or the Blessed Virgin Mary, that's like the greatest thing in the spiritual life. And Teresa's saying, no, it's actually, there's something deeper about the interior, either the imaginative and even more so an intellectual vision, where I don't see anything at all. I just know, like, Christ is with me, and I can't explain how, I can't say what he looked like, but I know he was there.
Profound and real, yes, yeah.
Yes.
Well, she came to see, in the life, she had arrived at what in the interior castle, her mature work, she would say was the six dwelling places. And so at that point, she hadn't arrived yet at the mystical marriage, the transforming union. And once she arrived at the seventh dwelling places, she stopped having most of those experiences. And so she's able to describe later on, once she's past them, that these manifestations, locutions and raptures and ecstasies, they're the result of the fact that, in a sense, the Lord is pouring in his life, but our bodies are not accommodated to receive it yet. And so this profound interior experience in our soul begins to manifest itself exteriorly in our bodies with these experiences. But the point being that ultimately it's something to be passed beyond, and Teresa experienced that and knew that. I think, speaking of St. John of the Cross, St. John of the Cross's kind of advice about visions and the like is really not to cling to them. That if they were of God, then God accomplished what he wanted in the instant you received it, and so there was no need to think about it anymore. And so he didn't want people to get attached to visions and the like. it appears to be a contrast that Saint Teresa spends so much time describing the visions and these experiences. But I think what Saint Teresa is doing is, number one, she's talking about her own experience, but she's writing for people who might also have those experiences, or potentially will as they progress. And so she's very much a teacher of prayer. And so she wants to walk through those stages, not believing them to be the end all and be all, but to kind of help them to see what it means and how it unfolds and what its fruits are and how it's moving you forward.
Yes, and then she's able to witness through her own life, too, how she didn't cling to them.
Right.
And she was able to, again, she was focused on what are the fruits of this experience and how does it help me to love my neighbor more.
Yes, exactly. And as I said, the constant perspective on what I really want is conformity of my will with God's will. And that's more fundamental than any kind of vision or locution you could have.
Yeah. Well, and maybe this is a good time, too, to bring up then one of the struggles Teresa had with one of the spiritual directors at the time was she's having these imaginative visions, and some spiritual director tells her that she should make a sort of rude gesture at the vision.
Yes, it's sort of his disbelief at this, but she's ever obedient. She believes she should be obedient. So as much as she hates to do it, she does it. Christ tells her to do it. And it kind of shows as amazing and creative and brilliant St. Teresa is. She's really very humble. When she calls people to humility, she demonstrates it in her life. So her spiritual director told her she should do it, and so she did it.
Yes.
Yeah.
As much as it pained her, though.
Exactly. Yes.
But yes, she made this, like the fig or whatever, made a gesture towards this image, whenever it would appear. And I guess thinking of the director was that would, if it was the devil, that would scare scare the devil away or something.
Exactly.
But but it was something that really made her rather distraught, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yeah.
Because she had this interior sense that she knew that this was the Lord.
Yes, as you say, as these experiences advance, there's just a more profound certainty that this is Christ, this is of God, and it's not the devil. I'm not being self-deceived. So the more profound, the more interior the experience, the more certainty there is.
And I think her obedience also bore fruit because she continued to grow.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So doing those things, listening to her director and those things didn't hinder her growth.
Exactly.
She still grew. And so then, we come to perhaps one of the most important, or at least most remembered mystical experiences of Teresa's life is the Transfiguration.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I think if anyone has seen statues of St. Teresa, Bernini's statue in Rome is one of the most famous, and it captures that well, actually, it happened more than once, but it captures that experience, this fiery dart that this little angel is plunging into her heart. This is it's the powerful expression of kind of what's more broadly called, love mysticism, a bridal mysticism, which is very, we see it in John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, this kind of affective mysticism that's not affective in the sense that it's kind of superficial emotion, but based on a deep yearning and desire, and it's visualized in that experience.
Yes, yeah. Maybe I'll just read a little bit about Teresa's words of that experience. She says, "It is a kind of wound in which it seems as though an arrow is thrust into the heart or into the soul itself. Thus the wound causes a severe pain which makes the soul moan. Yet the pain is so delightful, the soul would never want it to go away. This pain is not in the senses, nor is the sore a physical one, but the pain lies in the interior depths of the soul without resemblance to bodily pain." And so we see again how the more interior the experience is, the more real it is for Teresa, or the more, I don't know if real is the right word necessarily, but the more certain it is.
The Transfiguration reminds me, of in John of the Cross, where in the spiritual canticle, where the soul is seeking, the soul is wounded with love for Christ, the bridegroom. And as the spiritual canticle, the poem progresses, the bride discovers that the bridegroom is wounded. And so I think, when I think of the Transfiguration, her heart set on fire with love, I think, to me, I jumped centuries ahead, but I think about the Sacred Heart devotion, and the Sacred Heart always pictured as a flame with love,
Yes.
and Saint Teresa burned with love for Christ, but she discovered that Christ was burning with love for her.
Yes. Great. Well, maybe to wrap up then, if we could just mention, there's this book that you wrote, Father Mark, Learned, Experienced, and Discerning, St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross on Spiritual Direction, and, kind of distilling some of the wisdom of the saints about spiritual direction. And so maybe in reference to this book, but also in reference to what we've talked about today, what are some things maybe you would say for those who are listening who are looking for a spiritual director or have a spiritual, how do they be a good directee?
Well, unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, it's difficult to find a director these days. And so, and St. Teresa recognizes that, and she herself says, sometimes if you can't find a director at a human level, it's important to have spiritual friends who can support you on the journey. But to remain confident that the Holy Spirit is ultimately the true director. And so the Holy Spirit will guide you. But having found a director, both she and John of the Cross are on the same page about these things. The importance, as I mentioned, of being honest, of kind of being forthright with where you are, with the experiences you're having. And that's the only way that the spiritual director can really guide you, to help you. The spiritual director's role is to try to help discern the movement of the Spirit in the person, but at the same time discerning where the person is on the spiritual journey. And the spiritual director, he or she, can only do that if the directee is kind of honest and direct. And I think direction, as St. Teresa makes clear, there's an element of humility to it, of kind of being willing to be open. St. Teresa and John of the Cross because of their culture at the time, they probably have a more directive view of what happens in spiritual direction. The director is a real director of their spiritual lives than many people, which is different from how many people today view spiritual direction. But it still requires humility to kind of be willing to place your spiritual life in the hands of another, a companion, a guide, and to kind of lay things out as you experience them, and not trying to present yourself as more than you are, and more graces than you've been open to receive.
Yeah. No, that's very good. That's helpful. I think, and kind of bouncing off of that too, is something that reading Teresa's experience in this section of her life helps me to realize, is how God will work through the weaknesses of your director as well.
Yes, yeah.
Those things, they may feel like obstacles and like I have to find the perfect director. But no, God uses the weaknesses of, whether it's a director or, a boss or a spouse or whatever it is, God uses the weaknesses of that person too to help us advance in our spiritual lives. It just takes trust in Him.
Yes. And at the same time, St. Teresa, she changed directors rather often because of the circumstances. She wasn't hunting around. She wasn't shopping. But still, it's important to find a director who is able to kind of speak to your experience at the moment. And St. John of the Cross is very explicit about, in the Living Flame of Love, when he talks about spiritual direction most explicitly, some spiritual directors are good in the beginning, with the beginning of prayer, and that's really what they do very well. But they may not be experienced or learned enough in the more advanced forms of prayer. And so it's not a bad reflection on a director to discern that now's the time to move on. And it's not, the director's responsibility is to be prepared for that, to kind of encourage the people to move on to a director who might be able to help more.
Right. And if you can't find a director, which, like you said, it can be so hard today, you mentioned, the importance of spiritual friends, but also our friends, the saints, and their writings. And then even in the writings of people like you, we can find, and that's what Teresa experienced too, right? In her own reading, she was able to find a direction for her, what she was experiencing interiorly. So we can continue to go back to those places.
Absolutely. And St. Teresa's writing is, sometimes it's kind of hard for us to read, 16th century Spain and all of that, her way of speaking. She's kind of, she has a very oral way of writing, which is sometimes hard to follow. But her purpose is practical. She's trying to help her readers grow in relationship with Christ, to grow in this friendship, which is the heart of prayer. And so really her writings, in a particular way, are spiritual direction.
Yes.
She is a spiritual director to everybody who reads her, really.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Father Mark. It was great to have this conversation with you. And we hope that you'll join us again next week and know of our prayers for you. God bless you.